Hi, this is just a side video. I'm answering some questions from the sourdough starter video I did last week. I just wanted to make a few things a little bit more clear or go into some more stuff in a little bit more detail. One of the things I was asked was storing the sourdough starter in the refrigerator or whatever, and how to get it back, after that. The rule of thumb is you can put your sourdough starter, like give it a good feed, and then put it in the fridge, and you can keep it in there and feed it once a week indefinitely. It's not going to be a problem. I have got to the point where I was doing it once every 2 weeks, and that is absolutely fine. I have watched countless videos of people who said, all right, I'm going to get my sourdough starter out of the fridge after having been in the back of the fridge all summer long. And we haven't fed it or touched it all summer long because they were busy. And they were able to re-get theirs going, and it was perfectly fine. So I think there's a lot of fear about sourdough starter and how easily it can go wrong, but that's to me just misinformation as that word is used a lot these days. But sourdough starter is very forgiving, and it's very, like, it wants to live, it wants to work. So yeast and bacteria, you know how hard it is to get rid of those and like normal other things, and you're keeping yeast and bacteria in a jar. Like they want to live and thrive, so they're going to come back. But I would say if you're wanting to keep it, and use it often, I would feed it once a week from the fridge. After you've had it in the fridge and you want to use it, say, you're going to bake on Saturday, I would get it out of the fridge Friday morning and give it a good feed. And then maybe feed it in the afternoon and feed it in the evening. Because if you're going to bake Saturday, you're going to want to have enough starter to use in your recipe. So you're going to want to reactivate it just to get it eating and feeding and working and doing its job. If it's frozen, you might need to get it out a little bit, like maybe Thursday night, and then Friday morning feed it to start growing it to use Saturday. If you're doing reconstituting of flakes, say you got dehydrated sourdough starter in the mail, you might want to give it 2 days and just feed it like normal. Put your flakes in the bottom, whatever the grams are, feed it that many grams of flour and water, and then the next feeding, do the same thing, and then start to grow your starter so that you'll have enough for the recipe that you're going to do. So that's, keep it in the fridge, feed it once a week. You could do it once every 2 weeks. If you have forgotten about it for months on end, or you need to go on vacation, put it in the back of the fridge, you're good. It's going to be okay. And then give it time to feed it. Probably if it's been all summer, you're going to need to give it a few feedings to get it back to its glory and working how it should. So don't worry, you've got it. It's going to work for you. Now, if you're going to be growing your starter for a recipe, right? Like the recipe that I'm putting out today also says 2 cups of starter, and you're starting off with 30 grams or 50 grams, you're not going to feed it too much. The problem comes in if you don't have enough starter, or you're going to need to start from the beginning and make your starter. But if you have 30 grams of starter and you need 2 cups, you can have your 30 grams of starter and just put in a cup of flour and a cup of water and just mix it together. That the yeast and bacteria, they multiply, they reproduce. That's what they're good at. You're not going to overfeed it. It just needs time to turn the flour and water into starter. So you just have to give it enough time. So I have this old recipe book, and it tells their method of growing a starter so that you have enough for your recipe. I would say, in general, if you need 2 cups, if you're going to bake Saturday, in the morning, feed whatever you have, 30 grams, 50 grams, a cup of flour, cup of water. And then you can choose to, however much starter you need, you can choose to feed it another cup of flour and water before bed, or a little bit more. And it's going to be activating and eating and reproducing, and in the morning you're going to have a lot of starter, and it's going to be ready to go and bubbly and happy. There isn't really like, oh, you have to stick to this timeline, it's so stringent. It's not. If you know you're going to need 2 cups, sometime before, feed it at least 2 cups of flour and 2 cups of water, and you'll have your starter, and it's going to multiply, and you'll have more than 2 cups, so that you can have your 30 or 50 or whatever grams, you pull right out before you bake, and have that to the side so you don't lose your starter. You don't forget to keep some starter to the side, so you always have that, and then bake with this. But this method said the day before you bake, 8 o'clock, they do cups, they don't do grams. So start with your 1/4 cup of starter. 8 o'clock in the morning, feed it a 1/4 cup of flour, 1/4 cup of water, stir, cover. And then at 2 o'clock, just add right to that a 1/2 cup of flour and a 1/2 cup of water. Stir and leave it. And then at 7 o'clock, put in 3/4 cup of flour, 3/4 cup of water. Stir it, cover, and leave it. And somewhere between 10 o'clock and bedtime, they say to add a cup of flour and a cup of water, stir, and leave it. So all night long, this is just, you're creating this all day long buffet of food for your starter to just grow and reproduce and get bubbly and active and be happy. And then all night long, it's doing its job and growing. So in the morning, you're gonna have 5 cups, a little bit over 5 cups of sourdough starter. So you can just, like the recipe I have calls for 2 cups. If you're going to double that, you need 4 cups, right? If you want 4 loaves of bread, you'll have 4 cups of starter, and then you'll have a cup to the side for whatever you want. Or if you want to put in more starter to kind of help it work faster. So it's real simple. There's no fear in this. You've got this. The worst case is you end up having a little bit more than you wanted, which you can either discard, or you can throw it in some pancakes that you're making, or any other thing that you're making. There's tons of sourdough discard recipes. So if you have a little too much, that's okay. Another commenter said this, and I do know this to be true. Say you're making bread and then you decide, well, I want to double this recipe, and you put all your ingredients in, and then you realize, I don't have enough sourdough starter. That's the worst case scenario. You don't ever want to do that. And so you think, well, now I've mixed all this together, I don't have enough, I'll just throw it away. Well, you don't have to. If you're making a recipe and you don't have enough starter, put in what you can, making sure that you keep some to the side so you always have yours. And then you can always add a couple of teaspoons of regular commercial yeast to it. And it's not going to be true sourdough bread. It will be less sour than your real sourdough that's kind of needed to ferment all day long. It's gonna rise a lot quicker. So you're taking your baking time, not the baking, but the all day, letting the sourdough ferment and get its size and double. It takes a long time. So by adding regular commercial yeast, it's gonna happen a lot quicker, which means you'll have some sourdough flavor, but not that nice, like real sourdough flavor that we know and that we love. But you don't have to waste all of your ingredients. We know how precious they are. If you're giving it to somebody, make sure they know that, because there are some actual, I think they call them sourdoughtarians, where they will not eat anything with commercial yeast in it. Everything has to be sourdough. So it is not true sourdough bread. Just so you know, people are very particular about that. So there you go. So I hope that answers the questions I got about storing it in the fridge and then getting it back to life, back ready to use. And just as a side note, when you pull it out of the fridge after a week or two, it is very gummy and paste-like. And so it'll get back to its normal self. If you just pulled it out of the fridge and left it on the counter, it would bubble up. I lived under the fear of sourdough, thinking it was really tricky for a long time, and it's really not. I mean, it wants to work. So it's just learning a different way of doing something. That I think that's where the fear comes in, because it takes longer. You have to plan ahead. If I'm making, a recipe on Saturday, I need to know I have enough. The next question I had was about the hydration levels of the starter and getting different flavors. I am not an expert. I have tried it and I know it does work. There is so much science that goes into this, and there are some videos. There is a German man who has a channel called The Bread Code, I think. He's very funny. Some of his humor is a little off color, but he gets into the science of this, and it is like, it blows my mind. It's more than I can understand, and it's certainly more than I can understand and explain to you. So I've kind of boiled it down to what my mind can understand, because I like the science of it. The maths and the, pHs and like that gets to be too much. But we're going to go through a little bit of science with regular starter, like 1:1:1 ratio. 30 grams starter, 30 grams flour, 30 grams water. And it doesn't have to be 30. That's the number I'm using. 50, 100, whatever you want to do. Or if you want to do fourth a cup, whatever. 1:1:1 is just equal parts starter, flour, water. And that's your traditional sourdough starter. Most of the channels you watch, most of the recipes that you get, they're all going to be for your traditional starter. So let's start there and understand the science. Okay, I'm going to butcher this, and probably some science teachers are going to comment all the, you're not correct. I think that I'm correct enough that I understand this, but I can't give you the maths behind it. So when we do 1:1:1 ratio, what's happening is you're adding water to flour, so that is activating the nutrients that are in the flour. It's making it available to the yeast and the bacteria, because if you just put the yeast and bacteria on dry flour, you will get reactions. It will feed, but it's not how you would use it in a recipe. You need water to activate those components that make all of those nutrients available to the yeast and bacteria. So when we put in our yeast and our bacteria into water and flour, what happens is 4 things come out of that. Yeast makes ethanol and CO2, and the bacteria makes lactic acid and acetic acid. So we're going to get into that because we have to talk about what's going on to understand what we're doing when we have a high hydration starter or a stiff starter, a low hydration starter. The yeast takes off first. It is fast acting. It is eating all the good stuff in our starter, in our flour water starter mixture, and it is just passing CO2 and ethanol. CO2, ethanol. It's leaving that behind. So it's shooting up. The bacteria is always there and it's working, but all of a sudden it starts to get to eat the ethanol. It loves the ethanol, and that really kicks it into gear. And then it starts eating all of the sugars that are in the flour that have been made available by moistening it with water. So it's happy. So the yeast is going and the bacteria is going. The bacteria is slower than the yeast. What the bacteria passes is lactic acid and acetic acid. Lactic acid gives us the delicious sour notes that we taste in the bread and smell in the bread, and the dairy notes that are kind of under that. We don't smell those as much, but it makes that sourdough smell the way we know, the sour and the dairy notes. The acetic acid makes the vinegar notes, the pungentness that's in there. They work together and they make the sourdough that we know and love, that you can just taste it as I'm talking about and smell it. You know how good that is. So both of those acids work together to make the flavor we know. So the yeast is going first, the bacteria is going, and then all of a sudden the yeast peaks and then the bacteria start to go up. So the yeast is going to come off its peak, the bacteria is going to hit its peak, and we have this sweet spot of sourdough that we know and that we love. And you can make your bread more sour by putting it in the fridge overnight. When you get it in their bread tins or the Banneton baskets, however you're gonna, shape your bread, put it in the fridge overnight. You're slowing down the yeast from decreasing, so it's kind of held here, and you're giving the bacteria all that time to eat more and ferment everything and just put lactic acid and acetic acid out. So the longer you let it ferment or rise in the oven, in the refrigerator overnight or longer on the counter, it's better in the fridge because you halt the yeast from doing its job. you get this beautiful flavor, right? The longer you let it ferment in the fridge, the more flavor you're going to get, to a point. You're not going to have it for 3 days in the fridge and it's going to be light and fluffy bread. So that is our normal 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. If we want to have sourdough bread with a sour flavor, but maybe there's some of us who really don't like the sour as much. I think there was a commenter who did say that their husband doesn't like the sour flavor. So we want to use natural active yeast that we make ourselves, but we don't want a sour flavor. You're always going to have a sour flavor, but you can, mute it down quite a bit. We bump up the hydration 5-to-1. I mean, it can really be anything. You can minimally add water, and it'll be more sour. You can add a lot more water and it's less sour. What you're doing is letting the yeast do its job and activate. In the bacteria part of this, the acetic acid needs oxygen to do its job. So when we add more water, we're basically drowning it a little bit. So you're not going to have any of the vinegar notes in there. To get the sour, you need the lactic acid and the acetic acid to work together to make that sour more sour. So if we're taking away the acetic acid by drowning it out, it's not going to allow the sour portion of the lactic acid to truly develop. So you're going to be left with the dairy notes. So with a high hydration starter, you're drowning out the sour flavor and encouraging the dairy flavor. You're still going to get fluffy bread because the yeast is still doing its job. It's going to work. The typical liquid starter is a 5-to-1 ratio. So say you use 50 grams starter, 50 grams flour, and then you do 250 grams water. And you leave it the same amount of time. It's going to bubble and activate. If they want a cup of that or 200 grams of that, whatever they're asking for in the recipe, you just scoop it out and use it that way. You don't have to use more or less. I always tend to use a little bit more than what they say in sourdough. That's just what I do. But you can, experiment on your own. So you've made this high hydration liquidy starter. Use it just as they say, same 1-to-1, and put that in your bread. Your yeast is still going to work. The flavor is going to be tamped down to more of just the dairy notes. The sour, you will taste sour. You're going to know this is not commercial yeast bread, but it's going to be much less, and it's a really good flavor. And I've tried this so that I could talk about it. I noticed my bread wasn't as fluffy as a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. It was still fluffy though. It still tasted very good. It had good crumb, good texture. So that it just didn't rise as much. That could be something I've done wrong, but I've watched a lot of videos on this, and this seems to be the general consensus. So this is me telling you what I have learned and what I have done. High hydration starter. A stiff starter just means lower hydration. There are a lot of recipes for stiff starter, and it kind of goes all over. Some people have a recipe of 25 grams starter, 50 grams flour, 25 grams water, and that makes a stiff starter. I have seen people do 50 grams starter, 50 grams flour, 25 grams water. All you're doing is making it as thick as you feel comfortable with. And I know I'm giving you, there's no one recipe, and I can't say what is the best because I've only done this for a short time, but I've always liked a stiffer starter. I've seen people make their sourdough starter. They get it out and it's like Play-Doh, and they just pull off a bit and put it in their dough for baking. I've seen people, they do 1 to 4, I guess. Like they'll do 50 grams flour, 50 grams starter, and then like 10 or 20 grams water, and they're kneading their sourdough starter into a dough, and they put it in their mason jar, and you think, what on earth, this is so stupid. But after a while, it really does start to bubble up. It's always going to be stiffer. You're not going to get the big bubble rise like you would a 1-to-1-to-1 regular starter because there's just not enough there to do that. Of all the channels that I've watched about stiff starter, all these professional bakers, home bakers, like people in other countries, I did a deep dive. Stiff starters seem to be the way to go if you don't want the sour flavor. If you're going to do sourdough croissants, if you're going to do sourdough biscuits, if you're going to do sourdough, like there's everything you can think of to do sourdough. They want the natural leavening that you do yourself, the natural starter, natural yeast. They don't want commercial yeast, but they don't need that sour flavor. The way to do it of choice is not high hydration, which does work and is good. It's a stiff starter because you're doing the same thing. Instead of drowning the acetic acid, you're just starving it of the water. You're getting the same results, but in my least scientific way. So high hydration, you're drowning out one thing, so the acetic acid, it only leaves the lactic acid, and on its own, the dairy notes are what thrive. So if you give it hydration, but less hydration, you still get less acetic acid because it doesn't have the water to make as much like oxygen as it needs to thrive. So you're relying heavily on the lactic acid, the sour and the dairy. So you still have the acetic acid helping the flavors, but it doesn't give you the sour flavor because you need the acetic acid vinegar flavors to work with the sour to make super sour. Well, if there's less of the acetic acid, but still some there, you're not going to get sour. What's going to thrive is the dairy notes, but there's enough of the sour flavor to change the flavor so it's not so sour, it's very subtle, and you get not dairy notes, but just, I don't know how to describe it because I made it, and I tend to like a stiff starter because I feel like I can measure it better, but mine is still liquidy. The thing people describe it as is fruity flavor, but I don't taste fruity flavor. I do taste more flavors. You know what a regular loaf of bread with commercial yeast tastes like. It's delicious. There's a little bit of sour because you're using a sourdough starter, but it's a completely different taste and smell. And I'm doing such a poor job telling you. It's just different. It's its own delicious goodness all on its own. And you would still use it 1-to-1, like if it's saying, 30 gram or 100 grams of starter in this recipe, use 100 grams of your stiff starter. Whether it's a Play-Doh ball, whether it's somewhat liquidy, just thicker, you would just use the same. You don't have to put more or less in there. I would say, I always tend to use a little bit more, so I would just put a little bit more in there because that's what I do. But try it. And it does not take long. When you're doing a high hydration starter, you need to feed it a couple times for that dairy note to really kick in because there's enough of your original starter. There's going to be a flavor there. So you need to feed it at least twice before you notice a change in it. With the stiff starter, you could take your regular 1-to-1-to-1 starter and say, I want to try a stiff starter. So you get out 50 grams, add 50 grams of flour, and then 25 grams of water, and you're going to have a stiff starter, and it's going to do its job right there. If you're going to try doing a high hydration or a stiff starter, low hydration starter, if you're concerned you're not going to like it or you're just experimenting, make sure to take some of your original starter and keep it to the side and feed it as normal, your 1-to-1-to-1 or whatever you like, so you have it. And if you don't like these starters, you can just discard them. If you don't want to do that and you have a high hydration starter or a stiff one that you're not, in love with, you can always get it back to 1-to-1-to-1, feed it 1-to-1-to-1, 30 grams starter, flour, water, and it'll get back to how it was before. So you're never going to ruin it to where it's not going to work. You can always get it back. But your safest bet is to keep an original, the mother, they would say, If you like it, well then you've got a 1-to-1-to-1 to work with for the good sourdough kick bread, and then you have other ones to play with different flavor, and you just keep maintaining them the same way, keep feeding them the same way. So no worries in trying and experimenting. You can always get it back or just keep the original separate. I hope that I've left you a little enlightened and not confused out of your mind. Try both. You're not going to go wrong. All you need is 3 mason jars in a day. You know, make the same recipe 3 different ways. If you're going to be in the kitchen waiting all those hours for things to happen, you may as well do an experiment and try and see which one you like. I am excited. I really want you guys to try this and let me know. You know, maybe you've heard about this before, you know more than I do, then boy, I'm glad to hear from you. So it's a different way of doing sourdough, and it's exciting to know that you can try different things and get different flavors. You know, you're not stuck with the 2 strands that the commercial recipe or commercial yeasts use. You know, that's fun. So, and you can change flavors by, you know, when you make bread, adding in rye or einkorn or kamut or whatever into your flour mixture, and that's always exciting. You can change the one recipe you're really good at, and you can change the flavor, yet making everything the same way. It's really going to turn out pretty much the same way. So I hope that this encourages you and excites you to try this and know that it's doable and it's fun to experiment. All right, well, thank you for sitting through my subpar explanation of everything, but I think I've explained it. But let me know and I will answer any more questions. So see you later.